All right, everybody. Glad you're here for another Tuesday night conversation. Tonight, we are diving into a topic that I think, um, that I think every single one of us wrestles with, and that is anger. And not just anger, but the difference between anger and rage. And I think that's a very important difference. Anger and rage are not the same thing. Many of us do not understand that and haven't learned that difference. So, tonight in the comments, I would like you, as you're jumping in here, sorry guys, a little bit distracted here. Tonight, as we're starting, I'd like you in the comments to jump in. Let me know where you're watching from. And as always, feel free to share this live tonight. Invite somebody who might need it tonight. Do you know somebody that struggles with anger or rage? Invite them to come listen in. Okay, now why does this topic matter? I've said this many times. Anger itself is not really a problem. I say, what? Anger is not a problem? I'd say anger is not. Anger is not the problem. It's what we do with the anger that makes all the difference. Anger is one of the most misunderstood emotions in the recovery world. And honestly, I think it's one of the most misunderstood things in the church world, too. People don't understand what anger is and what the purpose of anger is. Some of us were told when we were kids, we were taught that anger is always sinful. Have you ever heard that? You shouldn't ever be angry. Have you heard that before? I heard that a lot growing up in a lot of different ways. Some people grew up with explosive anger all around them. Some people grew up freezing anytime anger showed up. And so lots of misunderstandings. So what's the truth about anger? The truth about anger is that anger is information. It presents information to us. Anger tells us something. Anger is actually a sign that our heart is still alive and that our heart is responding to injustice. That's what anger is all about. Now, what I'm about to say next may sound strange, but I'll say it anyway. I've said it before, and people usually look at me funny, but I believe that it may be the best example of healthy anger that I'm aware of. And I would say the person that I think of that has best demonstrated healthy anger is Mother Teresa. Now, how is that? How could somebody like Mother Teresa, that's not who most of us think of when we think of anger or when we think of healthy anger. But let me expand on that a little bit. In 1946, Mother Teresa, this was before Mother Teresa was Mother Teresa. In 1946, Mother Teresa was actually Sister Agnes. That's who she was originally, in a convent. And she went to India to serve in a convent. If I remember correctly, originally she went to serve as a teacher. And in 1946, while she was riding a train between Calcutta and, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Darjeeling, I believe Darjeeling, India, for a retreat. While she was riding a train, she felt what she described as a deep, unmistakable call from God telling her to leave the convent and to serve the most destitute people in the slums of Calcutta. Now, what caused that? The train she was riding traveled through the slums of Calcutta. And as she was looking out the windows of the train, she saw people. India had just been through a revolution. People had fled to Calcutta for safety. And when they came into the city, they were pushed into the slums and onto the streets where they lived homeless, without food, without sanitation. And she saw this and she became angry. In her heart, she said to herself, this is not right. Things shouldn't be like this. And that's the message of anger. When we experience actual anger, it's in relation to injustice. Now, it may be injustice towards ourselves, maybe injustice somebody else. But the thought there with anger is, this isn't right. Things shouldn't be like this. Now, when anger is healthy, anger does two things. Now, I want you to hear these. The first thing that anger does is it reveals a value. Anger reveals something that we care deeply about, usually in relation to a sense of injustice. The second thing that anger does is anger energizes action. When we get angry, we experience a rush of adrenaline that pushes us to move towards change. Maybe you've experienced this yourself, where you get angry and all of a sudden you go on a cleaning spree, or you get angry and all of a sudden you just get a lot of things accomplished. That's one of the purposes of anger, is to stimulate action and energy in our life. So Mother Teresa's work fits perfectly into the illustration of healthy anger. Mother Teresa, when she saw this poverty, when she saw the way that people were being treated there in the slums of Calcutta, she saw abandonment, she saw illness, she saw human beings created in the image of God being treated as if they were disposable, or as if they were even less than animals. She saw and felt the injustice of it, and she didn't turn inward, which is depression. Depression comes as an anger response when we're saying this isn't right, things shouldn't be like this, but we conclude, but it's never going to change. There's nothing I can do about it. That leads us into depression. She didn't move in that direction. And she did not move outward into rage or an attempt to control. She turned towards service. A perfect illustration of healthy anger. So in that sense, her life is an example of healthy anger at work. It's what anger is all about. But rage, on the other hand, rage is a different story. Rage is what happens when fear hijacks the wheel. And tonight, we're going to unpack all this. We're going to look at a definition of anger, healthy anger, and a definition of fear. And we're going to talk about how to respond instead of react. That's going to be our topic tonight. So I'm glad you're here. I hope you stick around. And if you end up with any comments, any questions, feel free to put them into the comments here, and I'll try to address them. So let's start tonight with anger. Here's how I frame anger in my approach to coaching. Anger usually, almost always, comes from a sense of injustice. Anger comes from an internal experience of, this isn't right. This isn't fair. This isn't the way things should be. We see or we experience injustice. Anger rises up when something violates our sense and understanding of how the world should work. Anger really is a type of protest, an internal protest inside of our bodies. It's a signal flare that something's wrong. Anger tells us something here needs to change. But here's the tragedy. When anger goes unaddressed, or when we don't have permission to express it, and that's the position that a lot of us have been placed in growing up, anger turns inward. And that inward turn of anger often looks like depression. Depression says, that's wrong, but nothing's ever going to change. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever experienced that feeling? Or it says, nothing's ever going to change. There's nothing I can do about it. Why should I even bother? Or it tells us, well, it really doesn't matter anyway. So anger, which was meant to mobilize us towards action, ends up collapsing in on itself, and we feel stuck, powerless, and resigned. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you, when you were growing up, when you became angry, when you experienced anger, how many of you were taught by your parents how to process and work through that anger in a healthy way? And how many of you were told something like, you go to your room, and when you get things under control, then you can come back out? Now, here's what I want to present to you. With all of our feelings, not just anger, not just fear, but with all of our feelings, we aren't born with an understanding and a knowledge of how to regulate those feelings. We're taught. We have to be taught how to self-regulate. And when what we experience is somebody telling us, your anger's bad, you shouldn't ever be angry. Well, I'm going to argue there are times when you should be angry. When you see somebody abusing a child and you're not angry, I'm going to argue there's something wrong with you. If you're a man and you see somebody abusing a woman and you don't become angry, I'm going to argue there's something wrong with you. Anger is a good, valid emotion, but we have to be taught how to press in and process it in a healthy way. When we're told anger is always bad, or when we are told something like, you go to your room, and when you get yourself under control, then you can come back out. When that is how we are taught to deal with anger, when that's how we're taught to react to anger, then what we learn is to suppress it. And that's not healthy. And that pushes us towards a state of depression. So, which one of these two options I'm going to give you did you learn growing up? And I'd like you to put this in the comments for me. When you were growing up, in watching your parents and watching your caregivers, the people that were around you, what did you see demonstrated to you when people experienced anger? Did you see an explosion where they blew up, they yelled, they threw something, they punched a wall? Or did you see suppression where they bottled it all up and they withdrew? Let me know in the comments which of those you grew up seeing. And I'm going to present to you today that neither of those is a healthy response. I see that explosion. I've shared in the past, man, when my dad got angry, my dad was always working on a car down on the hillside underneath where we lived. And my brother and I still joke about that if we had a metal detector, there's probably a couple $1,000s worth of Craftsman tools scattered over that hillside, because my dad would get angry. And when he got angry, he'd yell and cuss and he'd throw his tools. And they're scattered all over that hillside. Explosion. He'd explode on us. He'd punch a wall. I can relate to that. I can relate. Now, rage, on the other hand, let's define rage, because this is where we get confused. Most of us mistake rage for anger. We think of rage as anger cranked up to the max. But that's not what rage is. Rage is not really super strong anger. Rage and anger don't even come from the same place inside of us. Rage is a fear response. Now think about that for a minute. Rage isn't anger. Rage isn't being tough. Rage is actually an attempt to regain control when we feel powerless, when we feel threatened, or when we feel overwhelmed. Most of the time when somebody demonstrates rage, when they start to yell, when they start to throw things, when they punch a wall, a lot of the time they're not looking for a fight. They're kind of like that bully that puffs up and makes a big show, but they're not interested in fighting. What this person that's demonstrating rage is interested in, same thing a bully is control. He wants to manipulate and control what's taking place and what's going on. So, where anger, when we experience anger, anger says, this is wrong. Things shouldn't be like this. Rage, what it's yelling in our ear is, I'm not safe. I'm losing control. I have to do something and I have to do it right now. Rage is panic wearing the mask of anger. Rage is panic wearing a mask of anger. And rage is always motivated by deep-seated internal fear. When you're in rage, your nervous system kicks into survival mode. Maybe you've heard in relation to fear about that fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And the way that works, that actually, that fear response, that self-protection, that defense mechanism is controlled in the back of our brain, what a lot of people refer to as the reptilian brain. And it controls our base instincts. It controls things that we don't have to think about, like breathing, like our heart beating. We don't have to think about that to make that happen. But it also controls that fear response, fight, flight, or freeze. And rage is that fight response coming forward. I feel threatened and I'm afraid. When we're in rage, the nervous system's in survival mode and we are not reasoning. We're not thinking clearly. When we are engaged in rage, We're not discerning. We're not understanding what's going on around us. Our body, in rage, our body is reacting as if the house is on fire and about to blow up. And that's why rage always leads to broken trust, broken relationships, regret, and shame. That's what ends up in our experience when we react with rage. If you have any thoughts about what I'm saying, if you want to push back, feel free to stick that in the comments. Now, let me give you a practical example of how this works, okay? Hypothetical story. It's not really hypothetical. It happens to me a lot because I've got a half-hour drive into town on the highway every day to get to my office. So imagine you're headed down the highway. I don't know if Blas is in here with us today. Blas sent me a picture yesterday of his trip home from Miami. And man, I know when Blas makes a trip to Miami, his blood pressure goes through the roof on that drive. And so imagine you're on the highway. People are not driving well. Somebody cuts you off in traffic. An anger response is going to say, hey, that's dangerous. That shouldn't be happening. People shouldn't drive like that. Now that is an anger response. I see you there, Blas. An anger response is that's not right. But then in healthy anger, what we do is we recognize that injustice, that thing that's not right, that should be corrected. We take a breath, we slow down, we shake it off, and we keep moving. That is a healthy anger response. Now, what's a rage response in this situation? In a rage response, we react with fear. And in that response, our heart rate spikes. We slam on the horn. We swerve. Most of us, especially if we're in the car alone, we start cussing that person that cut us off. Maybe we stick our arm out the window and wave the single finger at them. We yell. Now, what's happening in that situation? In that situation, that is rage. That's not anger at all. That is fear taking over in our body and in our head. That's fear losing control. It's a fear of being harmed, a fear of being disrespected. And here's something I'll throw out there to you. A lot of times as I talk to people and they talk about how they blew up in a situation, they went off on somebody in some way. And a lot of times, one of the things that I hear nowadays is, I felt so disrespected. Now, what's up with that? What's up with that? That fear, it's a fear of disrespect. It's actually combining pride into a fear response. That's what that whole disrespect argument is about. I'm afraid of losing respect. My pride is harmed. What are people going to think if I don't stand up and intimidate here? Fear response, pure and simple. And I would argue that if you ever struggle with that statement, I just felt disrespected. I'm not going to let anybody disrespect me. Odds are that's coming from fear. That's a rage response stemming from fear. That's not anger. It's not anger. It's fear taking over. All right. Now, where do these patterns come from? I'm going to present that these patterns come from 4 sources. There are 4 places where we learn this response. And our response to feelings, our response to emotions, is always something that we have learned. It's something that we picked up and we've seen demonstrated from us and we've learned. I've shared before, I mentioned a minute ago, my dad would throw things. And I've shared in the past. That's something I saw him do, and it's something that I did as an adult. Now, why did I do that? It's because I watched my father respond to fear, and I mimicked his response. That's how we learn to deal with our feelings and our emotions. So 4 sources of our responses to rage. The first is childhood modeling. If we saw rage expressed by our parents, by our primary caregivers, by neighbors, by people at school, if we saw rage, we learned rage. If we saw suppression, push it all down, don't process it in a healthy way, then we learned suppression. We learn from what we see, and we practice as adults what we learned as children. A second place that we learn these rage behaviors, these fear responses, is from trauma. Trauma, now again, I'll give a quick definition of trauma because some people get triggered by the word trauma. We don't need to think about trauma as being that somebody beat us or somebody sexually abused us. Trauma, a common definition that's used in the world of therapy and in the world of recovery, a common definition of trauma is anything that our brain didn't know how to process. And as children, we didn't know how to process anything. And so initially, we experienced everything as trauma. And we had to rely on somebody showing us how to respond. Trauma wires our nervous system for threat. Trauma teaches us fear. I was just listening to a podcast yesterday, maybe, where a guy was sharing that as a child back in the 80s, it was the early 80s, he was growing up. You got to remember, life in the 80s wasn't like life today. Life in the 80s, man, we lived a little more on the edge. We played in the street. We shot bows and arrows. I don't know about you, but me and my brother sometimes shot them at each other. And so life was a little different. And this guy yesterday, I heard him sharing on a podcast about, he was about 9 or 10 months old, and his family, he was a big camping family, and they were headed off to go camping for the weekend. I was able to kind of relate to that because all of my kids, we were campers, and all of my kids went camping way before they were a year old. And he was saying that he was buckled into the car seat in the back of the car, and his mom and dad still to this day say that they heard a scream, and it didn't sound to them like it came from the back seat. It actually sounded like it came from outside the car. They pulled over really quick and they rushed around to where he was at in the back seat. He's about 9 months old, and he was strapped into a car seat, and he was turning blue. His lips were blue. He was turning blue. He wasn't breathing. He appeared to be dead. And they unbuckled him, yanked him out of the car seat, and in yanking him out of the car seat, they dislodged whatever it was that he choked on. And back then, something like that happened. That's just part of a Friday. And didn't take him to the doctor, didn't take him to the emergency room. They just went on to the campground. But now he's a grown man. He's an adult in his 40s. And he's known for being anxious. And he was sharing, he was with a therapist, did some work with a therapist some time back. And one of the things that they identified through some work they did with him, they began to ask him about what he had experienced, what kind of traumatic experiences he had had as a child. Because what they recognized is when he had a very severe fear response, his body reacted like a choking infant. Now, it's kind of crazy, isn't it? But it's kind of the thing where if we grew up in an environment where somebody struck us regularly, then as an adult, when somebody even raises their hand to scratch their head, we see that movement and our body reacts as if we're about to be struck. So we learn these responses through trauma. We learn patterns through a lack of emotional tools. Nobody taught us how to handle feelings in a healthy way. And then identity wounds. Now, what's that mean? It means when we grow up believing that we're powerless, believing that there's nothing we can do about anything, rage becomes for us a way to feel powerful, even if it's only for a second or two. I learned as a young child, I was a big guy, I was bigger than most other people. And I learned as a child, that if I felt intimidated, if I felt unsafe, if I felt fearful, I was big enough that I was able to intimidate. I was able to turn that around. And rage was a way to do that. If I yelled, if I puffed up, if I acted like I'm up to punch somebody, I didn't want to fight. Honestly, I really didn't even know how to fight. But if I acted like I was going to, I could gain control of a situation. That's a fear response. That's rage. So here's a question for you. If you're here, here's what I want to know. When anger shows up for you, how does anger feel? Now, anger, all of our feelings and our emotions operate together. They never operate individually, just one feeling at a time. When you feel angry, do you ever feel that? Does that ever come across with a sense of sadness or fear or frustration? I hear people a lot of times, they'll argue with me. I'm not angry, I'm just frustrated. Frustration and anger, pretty much the same thing. And when you feel those things, does that motivate you to take action, to make something right? Or does it push you towards suppression, depression, bottle it up and decide nothing's ever going to change? Does it push you towards rage? Well, I'm going to get loud. I'm going to yell. I'm going to appear violent in an effort to take control. Now, let's get to the heart of what I want to talk about this evening. And I want to talk about responding versus reacting. Rage comes from fear, which triggers a reaction. We respond instinctively. We react. I said respond. We react instinctively. We react in fear in a self-defense mode. When we respond, we're able to slow ourselves, calm ourselves, think things through, and move forward in a productive way. This is the heart of tonight's teaching. So, reacting is instinctual. Reacting is immediate. It comes from the survival brain. And it goes all the way back to our childhood and our infancy. If you've ever been around a baby, when a door slams or a dog barks or somebody yells, what happens? It's an immediate response. It stems from something called the vagus or the vagal nerve system. And I'm not going to go way into that. But it's an immediate fear response. A baby gets startled, its back arches, its arms go up, its head goes back, and it's a self-defense mechanism. It's a reaction, and it happens motivated by fear. Now, responding, on the other hand, responding is an intentional action. Responding comes from the reflective brain, the part of us that can choose a path forward, that can choose what we're going to do. So, what we want to do is we want to respond rather than react. We don't want to let fear seize control and cause us to do something that if we were thinking clearly, we wouldn't do. Have you ever reacted to something and then regretted your actions later? We can change that. Responding is intentional. So I want to talk about 3 steps to move from reaction to response. Okay. Step number 1, we need to pause and we need to name what's actually happening inside of me. We need to ask ourselves a question. What am I feeling right now? Now, I recognize that's a difficult question for a lot of us because we don't know what we're feeling. We're not used to examining what we're feeling. But we need to ask the question. And we need to try to identify, what am I feeling right now? Not what's happening around me, but what's happening in me. There's a difference there. Around me, there may be things that are taking place that I could perceive as threatening. But what's happening inside of me? So we need to name what's actually happening inside of me. Step number 2, we need to identify the real emotion behind the reaction. A lot of times beneath the outward anger that we experience is fear. That's what we've been talking about. And when we respond with fear, that comes across as rage, as an extreme attempt to gain control of the circumstances around us. So a lot of times beneath that outward anger, that sense that this shouldn't be like this isn't the way things should go, Beneath that may be a feeling of fear. It may be a feeling of sadness. There may be a feeling of shame or powerlessness. Maybe a feeling of betrayal. What are you feeling? Now, I'm naming a lot of feelings here. And it may take some work on our part to begin to identify what these feelings look like. And we'll be talking about some more of these feelings in weeks to come and how to identify these feelings when they're present in our life. Now, if we're experiencing these feelings, if the core emotion that we're feeling is fear, our response to that is we need grounding. We need to be able to calm ourselves. And there are tools for that. I have a video coming out here, I think next week maybe, on something called the 90-second rule. And it's the idea that studies show that when we get hit with that fear response, if we can just pause, take a breath, 90 seconds or less, then that overwhelming, controlling feeling will calm and will pass. What if that feeling, that core feeling that we're experiencing is sadness? What do we need? What are we looking for when we experience sadness? What we need is comfort. We need somebody to care. That can be something as simple as just putting an arm around us or laying a hand on our shoulder. It can even be something as simple as someone telling us or us telling ourselves, I think it's going to be okay. If it's injustice, then what we need to do is we need to set boundaries. So we need to choose a meaningful action instead of an impulsive reaction. A meaningful action instead of an impulsive reaction. Here's what responding looks like. I think we know what reaction looks like. Reaction looks like throwing something, like puffing up, like getting loud, trying to appear threatening in an attempt to gain control. Responding looks like taking a breath, a slow, deep breath. Responding may look like we need to walk away from the situation, whether that's for a few minutes or whether that's for the day. We just need to walk away. Responding may look like, and almost always will include, naming what we're feeling. That is an extremely important step. What am I feeling here? What's triggering this in me? What am I feeling? Responding may look like asking for clarity. Have you ever gotten angry, maybe reacted with rage, only to find out that you were mistaken about what was going on? Somebody says something and it sets you off, and then you find out that what you thought you heard isn't what they said. Somebody bumps into you and you assume and react, you assume that it was deliberate, and it wasn't deliberate at all. It was accidental, but you blow up. You respond, you react with rage, and you blow up. And then you feel shame. So asking for clarity, it may mean setting a boundary. There are times in our lives when we have to be honest and say, you know what? that person is just not safe for me to be around. This just isn't a healthy thing. And we need to set a boundary. Or maybe that boundary will look like, if you raise your voice, it's over. I'm not going to allow you to talk down to me. I'm not going to allow you to shame me. And if you attempt to do that, our interaction's done. Set healthy boundaries. It may be as simple as just saying, I need a minute. Let me have just a minute here. And then we withdraw and we breathe and we process what's going on. It may be, I know Blas, you talk about writing, about journaling. Man, I'm a big fan of journaling. It may mean that we process things through writing it out, through journaling. It's a healthy response. Your response may be prayer. I just need to talk this over with God. I need to talk it out. It may be talking to someone that's safe, going to a friend, going to a pastor, going to a spouse. When we choose to respond instead of react is going to be in the immediate. Most of the time, it's going to present as aggressive. When we respond keeps my dignity intact. My dignity and the dignity of the other person. Have you ever made a statement like, I didn't mean to do that? I really didn't mean what I said. It's because we're reacting instead of slowing down and responding. There's a difference. We need to respond. So, what are some practical tools for how to respond? Let me give you a couple tools here. First of all, tool number one is known as the 10-second pause. The pause interrupts the fear-driven nervous system response. When we feel threatened, we want to respond immediately. But that pause, being able to just stop, and may involve taking a breath. That pause interrupts that fear-driven nervous response. And it allows us to begin to calm ourselves and give ourselves an opportunity to respond rather than react. It may be that we begin to use a daily check-in. Man, I'm a big believer in check-ins. I've talked about check-ins before. I personally use a daily 4-step check-in that for me fits in perfectly with anger. My 4-step check-in, the outline is, number one, what am I feeling? What am I feeling today? What am I feeling right now? What am I thinking about? What am I doing? That includes things like, where am I at and who I'm around? And then what am I thinking about doing? Asking ourselves those 4 questions lets us process what's taking place and get a clear understanding and a perspective. Most rage episodes happen because people never paused long enough to feel and understand what's really happening in the situation. Tool number 3 is venting versus processing. Here's the idea behind that. Venting releases steam. Venting is just a sudden release of pressure. And venting would even be like in that example I gave earlier where somebody cuts us off in traffic and we punch the dashboard, we lay on the horn, we yell. We know what they can't hear us, but we yell. Venting releases steam. It's an attempt to have a large emotional release very quickly. Processing, on the other hand, we stop and we think about what's taking place, what's happening. And processing creates understanding of a situation. And then the fourth tool, this will be the last tool. I'm going to need to begin to wrap things up here, but tool number 4 is naming your need. Maybe you've heard me talk before about that process that I work through in coaching. Behind every behavior is a feeling, and behind every feeling is a need. What we have to do is we have to work back to identify the need. What's the need that I'm experiencing here in this situation? And name that need. Anger many times is pointing towards a need. Again, it's that idea of injustice. We see injustice taking place. Well, what's the need that's present that has to be met? Anger points to needs. Maybe that need is a need for respect. Maybe that need is for a sense of safety or clarity or honesty. Maybe it's a need for justice. Maybe it's a need for repair. It's a need for somebody to say, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I shouldn't have acted that way. If we can pause long enough to look for the need, then we can respond instead of reacting in the moment. Now, I want to talk for just a minute about what healthy anger looks like. Okay. Again, even the Bible says, be angry and sin not. So anger in and of itself is not a bad thing. Anger really has good motives behind it, identifying injustice. So healthy anger looks like, healthy anger is clear. We're not jumping to conclusions. We're examining and we're finding out what really is taking place here. Healthy anger brings clarity. Healthy anger is calm. Now, maybe you've experienced this. Something happens and somebody reacts and they yell in your face. What does that provoke in you? It provokes a like response. Healthy anger, on the other hand, is calm. Healthy anger is able to present calmness and to produce calmness in other people around us. Healthy anger can say, help me to understand what just happened. Is this what you intended? Is this what you're actually saying? Is this what you're actually directing at me? And it's said in a calm way, and it brings about calmness as a response. Healthy anger is direct. Have you ever had somebody talk behind your back? How does that feel? None of us like that. But then here's the other side of that question. Have you ever talked behind somebody else's back? Healthy anger is always direct. We don't talk about somebody behind their back. We go to them. We say, help me to understand what's happening here. Is this what you're trying to convey? Is this what's taking place? And we're speaking, we're interacting directly with the person that has produced that feeling in us. Healthy anger is values driven. Now, what does that mean? Well, again, anger reveals what we value. It reveals our sense of justice and injustice. It's values driven. We see somebody yelling at a child, and healthy anger says that child doesn't need to be talked to like that. They deserve better. And healthy anger allows us to step into that situation in a healthy way. We want to accomplish what's right. We want to accomplish, healthy anger moves us to accomplish what's just and to look for a just outcome in the situation. Healthy anger builds connection because it communicates truth. We're honest with ourselves about our feelings, and we're honest with the people that we're interacting with about the feelings that we're experiencing and that are being generated. Unhealthy anger destroys connection because unhealthy anger communicates fear and chaos. How do you feel when you're surrounded by chaos? What does that generate in you? Does it generate comfort? Does it generate a sense of peace? No, it doesn't. Healthy anger builds connection and communicates truth. Unhealthy anger destroys connection because it communicates fear and chaos. Now, in wrapping things up, how do we tie this idea of anger and rage with recovery? For those of us that are in recovery, it doesn't really matter what that recovery is from. Maybe it's a struggle with porn and sexual behavior. Maybe it's a struggle with substances, drugs, or alcohol. Maybe we're in recovery from anger addiction. And yes, anger can be an addiction. An anger addiction demonstrates itself by us continually putting ourselves in situations where we're allowing ourselves to be triggered by anger and fear. Do you have things in your life that do that? Things that you just continue to go back to, knowing even as you make that move to go back, it's going to generate anger. It's going to generate fear. There's an addiction problem there. You need to be in recovery. It can be any kind of compulsion. Any kind of compulsion. We need to be in recovery. So, for those of us that are in recovery, rage is always, I hate to use the word, and I shouldn't use the word always. Rage is almost always, it's often a relapse gateway. When we allow ourselves to hit that fear response, to hit that reaction, we know that what we're doing isn't healthy. Whether we say that out loud or not, we know that that rage reaction, that immediate reaction isn't healthy. And we often know that we're crossing a line there. And that generates shame, that generates guilt. And that opens the door to relapse. Many times relapse occurs immediately after those situations where we've experienced rage, fear in some area. Anger that gets suppressed becomes internal pressure. And when we're experiencing pressure and stress, we look for a way to relieve ourselves. For the alcoholic, that may be a drink. For a drug addiction, that might be weed, it might be a pill, it might be whatever. for somebody struggling with pornography or unhealthy sexual behavior. We feel stress and we look for relief. Rage becomes a way to regulate fear as we attempt to take control of the situation. When we can learn to feel anger without collapsing into depression, when we're able to name fear without escalating into rage, massive change happens. So, in wrapping up, here's what I want to ask you to consider. What's one thing that you're able to take away from tonight? What's one way that you can name that you want to respond differently this week? I got 2 questions for you to think about as we go our separate ways tonight. If you want, you can throw something into the chat now, and I'd like to see that, but I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. I'm thankful for each of you that have been here this evening. I know that as a general rule, we have a few people here at the live event. We have a number of people that come to watch the replay, either here on Facebook or YouTube or another platform. Yeah, pause before reacting. It's difficult, Mark. For me, it is. Man, for me, that's very difficult, but that's something that I have to work on continually, to pause before I react, to pause and respond. So, again, I'm glad you guys are here. I'm glad that you that are going to be watching a replay later on Facebook, on YouTube. I thank you for watching. Be sure to post in the comments where you're checking in from, where you're coming in from. I'm interested in knowing that. If you have any comments about anything that's been shared tonight, feel free to stick that into the comments. Don't forget to follow me here on Facebook or on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube. And remember that you can always reach out to me through my email, rwcoaching2@gmail.com, if you have questions or you want to talk. Next week's topic, when we get together, again next Tuesday evening, next week's topic is going to be forgiving ourselves without excusing the past. For most of us, when we think about our past, whether it's failures or struggles, past behaviors, we either try to run and not think about those things. And in doing that, we excuse our behavior, which needs to be processed and dealt with. Or we, yeah, my mind's going blank here. It's late. I am tired tonight. Anyway, that's good, Blast. Think before I react. Man, that's an important thing. Next week's topic, forgiving yourself without excusing the past. We don't want to just ignore what we've done in the past, but we don't want to wallow in guilt and shame either. All right. Thankful for each of you that were here. Glad you were here. If this has been beneficial, I'd encourage you to share it. Let other people know that it's available here on YouTube or on Facebook for the next 30 days. By tomorrow morning, it'll be posted on YouTube and it'll be there for who knows how long, maybe forever. Who knows? All right. Thanks for being here. Good to see you. And I will see all of you next Tuesday.